From very early on, people realized that a hill rising above the plain and the neighboring heights could become a reliable refuge from danger. It could even turn into a home, provided of course there was a source of drinking water on or near it. Once they settled on a higher ground, people felt not only safer, but also somehow superior to those who did not dare leave the valley. Superior, both in the literal and in the figurative sense. At a certain point in history, this realization came to the inhabitants of ancient Europe as well. I welcome you to a land that embraces the Eastern Alps and the foothills, is washed by the waves of the Adriatic Sea, lies between two great European plains, the Pannonian Plain and the Padana Plain, and gives birth to the rivers Mura, Drava, Sava and Soče. Today Slovenia lies in the heart of this region, some of it also divided between Austria, Italy, Hungary and Croatia. Just a century and a half ago, the most of these lands belonged to Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire, whose strong imprint can still be seen in the cultural heritage of these very different peoples. 3 centuries ago, part of this region belonged to the famous Venetian Republic, and that left its own distinctive mark on the coastal areas. And 2000 years ago, all this space belonged to a single great power, the Roman Empire, the first truly long-lasting project of imperial integration, which united Western Europe, the whole Mediterranean, and a large part of the Near East. But I would like us to go even farther back in time, to an age when there was neither a Roman Empire or even a Roman Republic. Let's try to step into a more distant era, the early Iron Age, and get a little closer to the lives of the distant ancestors of the people who still live between the Eastern Alps and the Northern Adriatic. And let's try to understand what role those very hills really played in their lives. Our first journey begins in Austria, in the land of Styria, in the Murtal, the valley of the Mura River, Mur as it's known in Austria. Here, not far from the historic town of Judenburg, on the outskirts of the village of Strettweg, the famous so-called cult wagon was found back in 1851, an object whose composition and detail are truly astonishing. It was created by the people of the Hallstatt culture, which flourished roughly between 800 and 450 BC. And it's worth recalling that the Hallstatt culture is often said to have grown out of the great Ornfield culture, which in the late Bronze Age spread its influence over almost the whole of Central Europe. The chance discovery of the cult wagon in a field in the distant year 1859 naturally suggested that somewhere nearby a whole necropolis must be hidden in the ground. However, excavations at that time were sporadic and isolated, and they did not bring many additional finds. Moreover, the exact location of the wagon's discovery was eventually lost, and scholars of the 20th century simply had to reconstruct it. Radical change came only in 21st century, with the advent of LIDAR and other geophysical survey techniques that allowed archaeologists to pinpoint the most promising spots for excavation. From 2004 onwards, researchers in this area began making one discovery after another. First of all, they finally identified the remains of a settlement, and it turned out to be quite large, stretching along the southeastern end of the Falkenberg hill. This hill begins immediately behind the last houses of Strettweg. The boundary of the prehistoric settlement on Falkenberg lay only a few hundred meters from the newly established find spot of the famous cult wagon. In addition, landscape surveys revealed several groups of the Iron Age burial mounds that had long been concealed beneath plowed fields to the east of Falkenberg. The artifacts found in these graves, as well in several other sites nearby, proved more than sufficient to justify opening an entire museum in Judenburg in 2019, dedicated to life in the Murtal during the Iron Age. On the basis of all these studies and on the variety of artifacts, we can now sketch the following picture. The settlement on Falkenberg Hill took shape right at the beginning of the Central European Iron Age, roughly around 800 BC. And it was not alone. Traces of smaller villages have been found on several hills overlooking the valley of the Mur. Overall, during the period between about 800 and 600 BC, the valley was quite densely settled. Its inhabitants imported salt from the mines of Hallstatt, not so very far away, reachable through the mountain valleys in 4 or 5 days. And from the southwest, along another network of exchange, even some prestigious goods from the Mediterranean made their way here. The settlement on Falkenberg Hill reached the peak of its development and wealth around 600 BC. At that time it was home to some 3,000 to 4,000 people, a considerable number for an alpine community. It was in this period that the richest princely graves appeared next to the hill, near the modern village of Strettweg. And one particularly prominent member of the local elite was buried together with that famous cult wagon. But half a century passes, and around 550 BC the settlement begins to decline. Clearly, some kind of crisis occurred. But what kind of crisis was it? We will return to that question a little later. Now we will have to travel further to the southeast, and to do that we will have to cross the southern part of the Eastern Alps. In the Iron Age, our route would have led either straight south along the valley of the Granitzenbach stream, or more likely roughly along the line of the modern Gabrielstrasse, over the Gabriel Pass, and then down from the mountains into a much broader valley. In that valley we once again meet the river Mur, which here races swiftly southwards. On this way we simply cannot pass by Schlossberg Hill, rising above the modern Austrian small town of Wildon, and the name of the hill tells us that a medieval castle once stood here. In fact, this hill is quite unique for Styria. It was inhabited almost continuously from about 4600 BC onwards. Several well-known Neolithic cultures left their traces here. Naturally, during the periods of the Ornfil culture and later the Hallstatt culture, there was still a settlement on this hill, and the low-lying necropolises where the hill's inhabitants found their final resting place have allowed modern archaeologists to learn quite a lot about the material culture of those distant times, and to trace possible routes of economic and cultural exchange with other regions. Here one can already sense the connections to northern Italy and, quite logically, to the middle Danube. But the road leads us further on. Just south of Schlossberg above Wildon, the river Sulm flows into the Mur from the west, and we now follow it upstream. The Sulm enters the Mur valley through a pass between the hills of Kögelberg and Frauenberg. Before we reach these hills, two old trade routes already converge here. One the way we have already been following, the other coming from the eastern bank of the Mur, from distant Pannonia. In front of us is Sulmtal, the valley of the Sulm, which winds its way between the hills. And here we will stop for a while, for this is the home of another and one of the most important communities of the Hallstatt culture. With its hilltop settlements, this community densely occupied the whole valley, from Frauenberg down to what is now the town of St. Martin im Sulmtal. The Sulmtal community was structured above all around three key hills, where life flourished in the first millennium BC. At the entrance to the valley stands Frauenberg, and its natural continuation Zigauberg. About 5 kilometers farther west lies the half-wooded Königsberg, seemingly crossing off the valley, and less than 5 kilometers beyond it to the southwest rises the striking Burgstall Kogel, well known to anyone interested in the European Iron Age. Here, the largest and the wealthiest Hallstatt settlement in the valley developed. Scholars are still trying to reconstruct the sequence and logic behind the emergence and development of these three centers of the Sulmtal-Hallstatt community. Their work is hindered by gaps in our knowledge, by the still limited investigation of Falkenberg and Königsberg, and crucially by the relatively small necropolises near these hills. The fewer burials with their grave goods, the less we can say about the material culture and belief systems of the valley ancient inhabitants. Even so, by piecing together the results of fragmentary excavations, the study of faint traces of ancient fortifications and lidar surveys, we can sketch roughly the following picture. All three settlements already existed in the last centuries of the Bronze Age, in the 10th and 9th centuries BC. At that time, it seems, more political weight was concentrated in the settlements on Falkenberg and Königsberg. But in the 8th century BC something has changed. Burgstall began to grow rapidly and went through two major fires, separated by about 50 years. Those fires do not appear to have been caused by enemy attacks, rather they seem to have resulted from careless handling of fire, or perhaps even from rituals in which the settlement was deliberately burned. Around Burgstall itself, archaeologists have identified, depending on the estimate, from 700 to 2000 burial mounds grouped into several separate clusters. Among them, the best known to a wider public are the so-called princely mounds of Krollkogel, Pommerkogel and Hartner-Mikkelkogel, first opened by 19th century antiquarians and then examined much more carefully by specialists in 1995. And their contents are astonishing. Even if we assume that not really all the valuable artifacts ever found there have made their way into the collections of the Universal Museum Joanneum in Graz, the finds from Krollkogel, Pommerkogel and Hartner-Mikkelkogel mound groups and the analysis of the construction of the tombs themselves are more than enough to show what kinds of prestigious objects the chieftains of Burgstall owned in life, and what they took with them into the past life world. The luxurious contents of these princely mounds are above all the insignia of power of the time. Feasting sets, weapons, armor, belts, horse harness, and even horse bones, probably from animals sacrificed during the funerary ceremony. Together they form a clear program of statues display, typical of Hallstatt elites. Among the finds are bronze situlae and boat-shaped and serpentine fibulae, clearly pointing to links with Italy, its Etruscan and Venetic societies. There are bronze cuirasses for warriors of impressive height, a helmet most likely imported from northern Italy, and a sword of the Tarquinia type, a local copy modeled on the weapons of elite warriors of the Villanovan culture, the direct predecessors of the Etruscans. The set from the Hartner-Mikkelkogel mound group shows striking parallels to 7th century BC burial complexes near Verrucchio, one of the best-known Etruscan centers on Italy's Adriatic side. But Italian motifs are only the part of the story. A bronze bridle with characteristic triangular ornament links Burgstall to Hallstatt communities in the Slovenian region of Dolenjska and to a wider cultural zone spanning the Eastern Balkans, the southern Danube region, and even reaching Greece. Other pieces of horse harness have close visual parallels in the material culture of North Pontic steppe nomads, while some motifs recall finds from the Caucasus. At the same time, a sword of the Gundlingen type points towards contacts with Hallstatt communities northwest of the Alps. In addition, entire sets of zoomorphic amber beads, very similar to those from Dolenjska, show how closely both Sulmtal and Dolenjska were tied to the Amber Road, which by the Iron Age was already operating, running from the lands of the Lusatians in the north southwestwards to the Adriatic, skirting southeastern foothills of the Alps. And finally, there is most famous and unique piece, a true work of art from Burgstall, a bronze mask with bronze gloves. It's far too small to be a death mask of the kind known from Greece or the Balkans. In its form and in the gloves, researchers see the echoes of Etruscan influence, not a direct copy, but a likely source of inspiration for the craftsperson who made it for the chieftain buried in the Krollkogel mound. It's quite possible that during the funeral this mask and the gloves were fixed to a wooden bust, meant to evoke how this powerful leader had looked in life. He was probably not just another local ruler, but a member of one of the dynasties that held power at Burgstall. Some researchers, among them the Slovenian archaeologist Biba Teržan, argue on the basis of the richest burials that the settlement was indeed ruled by dynasties of the local elite. How far did the power of these enigmatic chieftains of Burgstall reach? And was it purely political, backed by military force, or a blend of early state-like coercion and the authority of the region's main cultic center? We don't know for sure, at best we can only speculate. What we can say with confidence is that between 800 and 550 BC, Burgstall was the largest and the wealthiest settlement in the region that today includes the south of Austrian Styria, the whole of Eastern Slovenia, and the Croatian Zagorje. In Slovenian scholarship, all the Hallstatt communities in this area are usually grouped into the broader Styrian Pannonian group. In German and Austrian literature, the term Sulmtal group is more common. It also includes Falkenberg and neighboring Murtal settlements, implicitly emphasizing the primacy of the Sulmtal community. Yet these are only modern scholarly labels. The real balance of power in the region in the 8th to 6th centuries BC, whether Burgstall leaders were seen as overlords, or whether this was rather a network of more or less equal communities, remains an open question. The 6th century BC was a turning point for the Burgstall community, just as it was for the inhabitants of Falkenberg near Strettweg. Between 600 and 550 BC, the hilltop settlement declined. No new burial mounds were raised over the deceased chieftains and warriors. Most people apparently moved elsewhere, and over that century the Sulmtal Valley gradually lost its role as a key transit corridor on the route from Pannonia to Carinthia. We now leave the archaeologically rich Sulmtal Valley and move about 20 kilometers farther south along the Mur, following its course downstream. On the way we stop at Bubenberg Hill, which rises directly above the right bank of the river, and today it's split between Austria and Slovenia. Its slopes still preserve the traces of another important fortified Iron Age hillfort, probably within the sphere of influence of the Burgstall chieftains. From the Slovenian side of the border, these remains are known as Gradišće Novine. And looking southwest from the top of Bubenberg, you can make out another high hill, Plački Vrh, also standing on the Austrian-Slovenian border. And right by the Bubenberg hill runs a valley that is now one of the main railway and motorway corridors between the two countries. Since Plački Vrh too was an Iron Age hillfort, it's quite plausible that in the 8th to 6th centuries BC these two heights watched over the passage through the valley, leading farther south. That is where we are heading next, now entirely on Slovenian soil. After some 15 kilometers among the low hills of Slovenske Gorice, we reach the banks of another great river. Rising in eastern Tyrol, it crosses Carinthia and then flows on towards the Pannonian plain. This is the Drava. People began to settle its banks farther west, in the area of present-day Russia, intensively towards the end of the Bronze Age. These were communities of the Urnfield culture with their own local character. They already had well-developed metalworking, and after the 11th century BC, they increasingly used tools whose form points to contacts with the Mediterranean. Their pottery, fibulae, and weapons show links above all with the Sulmtal community, but also with Pannonia, the Middle Danube region, the Southern Balkans, Slovenian Dolenska, and northern Italy, especially the area of the Goloseca culture. There are also parallels with material cultures in the Western Alps. In other words, here on the banks of the Drava, roughly between modern Russia and Ptuj, a crossroads emerged between a wide circle of late Bronze and early Iron Age cultures. Modern archaeology refers to these Drava Valley pre-Hallstatt communities, which in the 11th to 9th centuries BC still occupied low-lying settlements along both sides of the river, as the Rusche group, or Maria Rast Gruppe in Austrian academic sources. Soon, however, the evolution of these communities and the growing need for security against the spread of the Hallstatt culture across the Alpine world led to the construction of a hill fort, whose traces are still very clear today. That hillfort offered a far-reaching view, apparently as far as the summits of Plački Vrh and Bubenberg to the north, and across much of the Drava plain, Dravsko Polje in Slovenian, to the east. This hilltop settlement, which grew up just south of the outskirts of what is now the Slovenian city of Maribor, is known to us as Poštela. Right from the start we should remember that the Poštela hill fort did not suddenly appear at the turn of the 9th and 8th centuries BC. Archaeology shows traces of human presence there already in the late Bronze Age. The two necropolises discovered nearby on the Habakkuk Plateau, one with typical urnfilled burials where the ashes of the dead were placed in funerary urns, and the other with classic Hallstatt burial mounds, bear witness to a gradual evolutionary transition from one culture to another. But Poštela only became a truly substantial settlement fortified with ramparts somewhat later. And its history as we understand it today in some respects runs parallel to the stories of the settlements on Falkenberg and Burgstall. Researchers who have excavated at Poštela at different times distinguish three archaeological horizons beneath the surface. The first takes shape towards the end of the 9th century BC. Fortifications already appear, but the internal structure of the settlements is still very simple. Then something changes abruptly between the second half of the 8th and the beginning of the 7th century BC. We see traces of fire, followed by a period with no clear evidence of houses, although signs of human activity continue. It's possible that in this phase Poštela was transformed into a kind of sanctuary, a place for ritual gatherings that large numbers of people visited only occasionally. Finally, a third horizon is clearly visible from the 7th century BC onwards. Here the remains of houses and huts reappear, and among these finds from the 6th century BC there are even fragments of Attic pottery from Greece. At its height, the settlement at Poštela covered an area of about 6 hectares, and in the 7th and 6th centuries BC was protected by massive earthen ramparts, some of which can be still seen today. Even now it's possible to make out where a kind of gate once stood, the entrance into the settlement. It's quite possible that people walking through the woods on that hill today make their way up along a path that follows exactly the same line as the one taken some 2600 years ago by those approaching the hill fort on foot or sometimes on horseback or in small wagons. Peasants from the valley, craftsmen and warriors, the chieftains and traders from afar, children, adults, the elderly. Interestingly, unlike Burgstall, life at Poštela did not halt in the 6th century nor even in the 5th century BC or later. By the 5th century, the settlement was no longer as large and no longer played the prominent role it once did. Yet people continued to leave traces of their presence there throughout the Latin period. There are even indications that the site was still visited and used in the time of the Roman Empire. On we go. To the east of Poštela stretches the Dravsko Polje plain, whereas the Drava continues its journey. To the east there are many sites of a great interest for Bronze and Iron Age archaeology, including several more hillforts built by people whom we now count as a part of the Styrian Pannonian Hallstatt group. But those areas deserve a separate story of their own, and I will tell you that story hopefully in the upcoming months. For now, we turn to the southwest, following the foothills of the Pohorje range. Not far from Poštela, within a direct line of sight, lies one of the easternmost hills of the Pohorje mountains. Today its southern slopes are occupied by the village of Črete while in what is now woodland there once stood another Iron Age hill fort. It was small, covering about 1.4 hectares, and roughly contemporary with the first and second occupation horizons at Poštela. Earthen ramparts defended it on the north, west and partly on the eastern side. So far, archaeologists have investigated 30 burials at the foot of the hill, with typical ceramic finds, and we know that substantial earthworks were carried out within the settlement. Yet the evidence remains too fragmentary to give a clear picture of how this hill fort developed. Perhaps future research will fill in the gaps. Continuing southwest, roughly along the line of the Amber Road, which in the first millennium BC runs somewhere through this region, we reach a long hill projecting southeastwards from the Pohorye Massif, Brinjeva Gora. Here a settlement with a very long history took shape. Excavation shows that the hill was already inhabited in the early Bronze Age, around 900–600 BC. Unlike Poštela, Bubenberg, Burgstall, and many other hillforts, Brinjeva Gora was settled long before most of the sites we have discussed even existed, even in their earliest Urnfield phases, and before the Urnfield culture itself began to spread across Europe. Life on Brinjeva Gora remained active at the end of the Bronze Age and through the transition to the Iron Age with its Hallstatt culture. In the second half of the 6th century BC, however, these ancient hillforts ceased to exist for reasons we still don't fully understand. Patterns similar to those at Burgstall may be at work here as well. Some 4 centuries later, at the late Latin period, just before the Roman conquest of these lands, people returned to the hill and the site came to life again. Now we turn to the southeast. Passing the vineyard-covered hills around Slovenske Konjice and crossing a stretch of lowland, we see a broad gateway opening to the south between two hills along the valley of the Dravinia river. In the early Iron Age there were settlements on these heights as well, known today as the Hradišće Homec and the Hradišće Vrhek. For the moment we cannot say whether they were true hillforts or simply small Hallstatt villages, since so far only pottery fragments have been found on their sites, along with a few dozen burials on the foot of Vrhek. Yet their position, two neighboring hills with a river flowing between them, strongly suggests that they controlled the southern passage, and it leads into a landscape of low hills, where the influence of another, larger settlement was already felt, one that may have formed a separate political center in this part of Slovenian Styria, the settlement on Rifnik, on a hill whose ascent begins almost immediately beyond the southern edge of modern town of Sulmtal. Rifnik is one of the highest hills in the chain we are now following. Its summit reaches 568 meters above sea level, slightly lower than Brinjeva Gora, which rises to 625 meters at its highest point. But subjectively, when you look from Rifnik down into the surrounding valley, the drop of height is more than 250 meters, while around Brinjeva Gora it does not even reach 200. So the people who once settled on Rifnik may well have felt that they were living on a rather high mountain, watching over a wide stretch of land all around. When did this lofty settlement on Rifnik first appear? Archaeological finds show that people were present there already in the Copper Age, but the first permanent settlement, visible in the form of clearly defined building remains, belonged to the late Bronze Age. It continues steadily through the transition to the Iron Age and into its early centuries. However, so far traces of only 8 buildings with stone foundations have been clearly identified. At the same time, there is yet no firm evidence of any defensive structures around the settlement, either in the Bronze Age or in the Iron Age. It's simply because of the height of the hill and its very steep slopes on all sides except perhaps the western one. Or maybe, who knows, it also had some kind of sacred statues in those ancient societies, much as Burgstall seems to have had. Excavations on Rifnik have allowed researchers to distinguish 3 horizons, which in this respect makes it comparable to Poštela, though these two sites do not align chronologically. The first Rifnik horizon probably dates to the 11th–9th centuries BC. Its ceramics closely parallel finds of the same period from Brinjeva Gora. The second Rifnik horizon resembles the first Poštela horizon I mentioned earlier. Strikingly, the grooved lugs on some vessels point to connections far beyond Slovenian Styria. They recall pottery of early Iron Age Gava culture, spread across the Eastern Carpathian Basin, the lower Danube and the Balkans. Other ceramic trails point either to second Poštela horizon or to Hallstatt finds from far away as Moravia, as well as to closer parallels from the Ljubljana area. In other words, the potters of Rifnik knew not only motifs borrowed from their regional neighbors, but also ideas circulating across a very wide area, from the southern Carpathians to their westernmost foothills, linked by a long-established route of a culture and commercial exchange, the river Danube. The third horizon on Rifnik clearly belongs to the early Iron Age, the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Finds from this period match well the material known from Hillforts and cemeteries of Hallstatt communities across the Eastern Alpine region, especially the second and third horizons at Poštela. After that the finds become rarer. In the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the Rifnik Hillfort clearly lost its importance. Burials from this time also became rare in the necropolis at the foot of the hill. The need to reoccupy and defend this height against external threats would arise only in late Roman times. That, however, is a separate and very interesting story. For now, I will simply stress that the late antique face of Rifnik and the striking remains from that period on the summit often overshadow in public perception and tourist materials the equally fascinating story of the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age on this hill. From Rifnik, our route now turns west, following the valley of the Vaglaina river and running alongside yet another chain of wooded hills, which we'll keep on our left as we go. We watch the Vaglaina flow into the Savinja at the very point where the Savinja itself swings sharply south, cutting a passage between those hills. Directly above this confluence stands the town of Celje, medieval Cilli, Roman Celje, whose roots reach back to the Celtic Celje. We will not stop here, though it worth noting that on Miklavžev Hrib, the hill rising on the right bank of the Savinja, there may once have been a settlement. Fragments of Hallstatt period pottery point in that direction. Our next and final stop on this journey lies a little further to the west. Already from Miklavžev Hrib you can see how the wide Savinja valley stretches out to the west, reached by wooded hills. This valley is a true crossroads of major European and local trade routes, shaped by the landscape as well. All routes from Pannonia, whether past Brinjeva Gora or past Rifnik, inevitably lead here. It can also be reached from the Posavia region, and by following river valleys northwards, you come to Carinthia, and once again to the banks of the Drava. And most importantly, from the Savinja valley you can continue west. By following small river valleys and crossing the pass near Trojane, even a traveler on foot could reach the Ljubljana basin, the next great valley, just within a day. Most likely the Amber Road I mentioned earlier continued westwards from here in just this way. People began to settle in the Savinja valley long ago, but traces of lowland settlements became clearer in the Bronze Age. Flat graves on the eastern edge of modern Šempeter and a long-known necropolis that certainly existed by the 9th century BC on the opposite bank of the Savinja, west of today's Grige, long suggested that the people buried there must have lived nearby. From the 8th century BC onwards, typical Hallstatt burial mounds also appear at several points between present-day Grige and Sveti Lovrenc. The fashion for this new ritual clearly reached the valley. A few mounds were even built more than 4 kilometers south to the valley edge, on the slopes of Gozdnik mountain. There was no shortage of burial places, but no clear trace of a settlement or network of settlements from which the dead had come. This puzzle remained unresolved for a very long time. The tumuli on the right bank of the Savinja between Grige and Sveti Lovrenc had been known for generations, low rises in fields and woodlands that were simply too obvious to ignore. The first systematic investigations were carried out by museum specialists between 1883 and 1886, when it was already clear that at least 7 mounds had been opened earlier by unknown treasure hunters. Fortunately, many burrows in the forest remained undisturbed. Professional excavations continued sporadically at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and only then were the grave goods properly recorded and passed to museums. In 1938, earthworks accidentally exposed a burial near Sveti Lovrenc. Truly large-scale, careful research in the Grige area, however, took place only in the 1960s and again in the late 1980s, but even then the location of the corresponding settlement remained an open question. Logically, many eyes turned towards Mount Home. It rises almost in the middle of those scattered groups of burial mounds. It's also not far from Schempeter, where an Iron Age burial horizon was found beneath the famous Roman period cemetery, and on the other side it stands within reach of the slopes of Goznik, with yet another small barrow group. What is more, Home has a clearly defined terrace, somewhat below its summit, an ideal place, one might think, for a settlement. And the summit itself, where the church of St. Mary Magdalene and the mountain hut now stand, looks very much like a natural spot for a small acropolis. Starting from these assumptions in 1956, a team led by Lois Bolta, the Celje archaeologist who had also carried out extensive work on Rifnik, opened two trial trenches, one on the terrace on Home and another on the summit near the church of the St. Mary Magdalene. The trench on the terrace produced a few fragments of prehistoric pottery, but nothing at all was found near the church. At that stage there was still no archaeological proof of a settlement on the hill. Yet Bolta remained convinced that a community similar to one on Rifnik during the Hallstatt period must have existed here, on Home. Only in 2011, after careful surveying of land near the village of Szeszcie, were traces found that might be taken as the first signs of a lowland site. However, the character of the remains suggested something different, more likely an open-air cremation place, where dead bodies were burned before burial. Once again, the larger settlement that had excited generations of scientists slipped through their fingers. At last, in 2013, fortune smiled a little to the researchers. Planned technical work had to be carried out around the telecommunication masts on the summit of Home. Archaeologists seized the opportunity and opened trenches in several spots between the antennas and the church. This time, alongside fragments of pottery, they identified a series of features that clearly indicated human habitation. A wooden post in a securely stratified building context, cut features interpreted as the foundations of timber structures or storage pits, and a likely hearth. In addition came a new series of finds, more fragments of pottery, clay spindle wells and clay ring, a whetstone, fragments of bone, and almost complete bowl. The plateau where all this was discovered is quite small, but if people once lived there, it's quite possible that other buildings stood where the church and the Planinsky Dome, the mountain hut, now stand, areas never yet touched by an archaeologist's spade. Some scholars even suggest that when the first version of the church was built in the 14th century, the most obvious Iron Age remains on the summit may simply have been destroyed or thrown down the steep slope. For medieval builders, they had no value at all. So when might the settlement on Home have arisen? Researchers are now carefully dating both the grave goods from the tumuli and flat cemeteries around the hill, and the relatively recent finds from the summit itself. If we accept the well-founded hypothesis that all those burial grounds on the foot of the mountain and the Iron Age graves on the outskirts of Schempeter and near Žalec belong to one and same community living on the hill, then the fate of Home to some extent mirrors that on Rifnik. These finds point to very close links with Rifnik and to significant influence from the material culture of Poštela and other Iron Age settlements in the Slovenian part of Styria. The oldest of these finds are those from graves near Schempeter, date to roughly the late 9th and early 8th centuries BC. The settlement on Home begins to develop in the 8th century BC, and in the second half of that century the first burial mounds appear on the foot of the hill, one of the clearest signs of the spread of the Hallstatt culture. The community on Home then continues without interruption throughout the 7th and into the first half of the 6th century BC. After that, decline sets in. It's possible that in some form the settlement survived into the early 5th century BC, but this phase is marked only by isolated finds around Rifnik and Miklaužev Hrib, as well as around Home itself. A time of change had clearly come, one that we still do not fully understand. What is obvious, however, is that towards the 5th century BC, the hills of this region became less central to people's lives, or perhaps there were simply fewer people living there at all. The route we have just followed together includes of course only a fraction of the hilltop settlements that existed, or may have existed, within the territory of the Styrian Pannonian Hallstatt group, known in German language scholarship also as the Sulmtal group. We have left aside for now the Hillforts in the Slovenske Gorice, the settlement at Ptuj and on Ptujska Gora, the hills around Polčane, the distant almost steppe-like Prekmurje region, as well as the northernmost hilly areas of Croatia. Even quite close to the Savinja valley, near the spa town of Dobrna, there are hillforts worthy of attention. But not everything at once. These directions I plan to explore in future videos. Even so, on the basis of just a few of the hillforts we have looked at, we can begin to picture how these settlements developed over the course of the late Bronze and early Iron Ages. In schematic form, the phases of their emergence and growth might be described roughly as follows. The oldest in the group is undoubtedly the settlement on Schlossberg above the Austrian town of Wilden. Its origins, it seems, go back to the Copper Age, to the Neolithic. Next comes Brinjeva Gora, with finds reaching back to the Middle Bronze Age. For both Schlossberg and Brinjeva Gora we can speak with near certainty of continuity in settlement. Centuries passed, the volcano on Santorini erupted, the Minoan civilization on Crete declined, and the Mycenaean world flourished. The Hittites asserted their power in Asia Minor and clashed with Egypt over the Levant. The Bronze Age crisis rolled in with drafts, the destruction of Mycenaean palaces, desperate pleas from Ugarit, and the incursions of the Sea peoples. And on these two hills it seems life went on its own way, despite social and economic change and the new cultural landscape that the early Iron Age was bringing. The beginning of the first millennium BC, when the ashes of the dead were buried in urns without barrows, marked the expansion of hilltop settlements in Sulmtal. At this stage, Burgstall was not yet the most important among them. At the same time, life was flourishing along the Drava, whereas the communities of the so-called Russia group still lived in the lowland settlements, a crossroads where trade routes from Italy, Pannonia and the southern Balkans met, not far from the Alpine copper mines and the salt mines of Hallstatt. And we should not forget Rifnik. Already in the 10th and 9th centuries BC, the first signs of a permanent settlement are visible on its summit. The turn of the 9th and 8th centuries BC becomes a watershed moment. Hillforts spring up everywhere. Falkenberg near Strettweg, Burgstall surging ahead in scale and influence. New hilltop sites on Plačke and Bubenberg, Poštela, Čreta, Home. Building is going on all over, and everywhere people are either raising fortifications or relying on the natural steepness of the slopes. Under each hill during the 8th century BC, barrows appear, often in separate clusters, marking the graves of people of particular status, members of specific clans or local micro-communities. The 6th century BC brings change to practically all the communities living in what is now Styria. Earlier in some places, later in others, but overall we can say that all the hilltop settlements we have visited, from Falkenberg above Strettweg to Home, enter a period of deep crisis from around 550 BC onwards. Isolated finds dated to late 6th and 5th centuries BC still attest to small numbers of people, but compared with the quantity and variety of artifacts from the previous 3 centuries, it's almost nothing. Alongside the depopulation of Styrian hillforts, we sense a further cultural shift in burial customs. Barrows gradually disappear, and in some areas, for example in the Savinja valley, skeletal burials in simple graves appear. There is a sign that a new people were settling here, bearers of a different cultural tradition. Why did the decline occur, and where did the people of the hills go? Even if the hillforts at some stage simply ceased to be needed, life could have been going on in the valleys, closer to the fields and to water. Yet the sharp drop in burials after the 6th century BC clearly points to a rapid decrease in population. For the most part, people either migrated away or simply died out. What processes lay behind this we still don't know. For now we have only hypotheses. Some explanations point to social change and economic reorganization within Hallstatt communities, others to an epidemic that may have cut down part of the population and set off migrations among the survivors. One of the most intriguing possibilities to my mind is this. In the 6th century BC, the inhabitants of the Styrian hills may gradually have been driven from their long inhabited sites by fear of nomads of the Scythian circle, who by then had established themselves on the plains around the Middle Danube, in what is now Hungary. So far, archaeology in Styria shows no clear evidence of assaults, battles and destructions we would expect in such cases. Those appear elsewhere, closer to Slovak section of the Carpathian Arc and in Moravia. At the same time, the appearance of occasional skeletal burials, distinctive horse harness, and in some places trilobate arrowheads typical for the Scythians, even in Alpine valleys like the Murtal, points to something else. Steppe people, riders unfamiliar with Hallstatt traditions, or groups already under Scythian-like influence, began to appear on the fringes of the Alps. A direct bloody conquest of the long-established hilltop communities seems unlikely. What we see instead looks more like infiltration of small groups of steppe people or steppe-influenced groups into Hallstatt communities in Styria, leading perhaps to a partial replacement of one culture tradition by another. So, in the end, what were the hillforts of the Eastern Alpine region in the early Iron Age? Were they really just fortresses where people lived generation after generation behind massive ramparts, or merely refuges, places of temporary shelter for the whole population, their goods and livestock, to which people from the valley villages came only in times of a danger? Or was a hillfort something more than a place of residence, temporary or permanent? Might it also have had a ritual, cultic role? Perhaps above all it was a sacred settlement, permanently occupied only by those who knew how to speak to the gods, those entitled to live a little closer to the sky. That early Iron Age hillforts could indeed have had multiple functions is clearly shown by the analysis of Poštela and its necropolises by Slovenian researchers Matija Čerešner and Dmitry Mrekush in their study Identities of the Early Iron Age in northeastern Slovenia. Imagine the eastern slopes of Pohorje and the edge of the Dravsko-Polje plain with no city of Maribor, no Razvanje, Spodnje Hoče, Pivola or other villages, no roads, no airport, no railway. The hillsides are far less wooded than today. Especially bare stands the hill crowned by the mighty ramparts of Poštela, visible from afar. Just below lies the small Habakuk plateau. There we can see two separate barrow groups, and a little farther south a cemetery where people are still buried in the old way, as in the Ornfield period. Looking south from the plateau across the plain, the monumental barrow of Kos is clearly visible. It still rises in the middle of Razvanje. A kilometer farther south there is a large barrow group on the site now occupied by the botanical garden of the University of Maribor. All these formed parts of a single landscape ensemble, a political and cultic center at the same time, and the monumentalized memory of one community. There is a clear logic in the way the barrow groups are arranged around the hillfort and in the surrounding landscape, at Poštela and at similar sites. Direct line of sight from the central settlement to the barrows is crucial, as the visibility from one prominent mound to others farther away. The paths leading from the gates of the hillfort to the barrow groups also matter. You can almost see ritual processions moving along them. And the hillfort itself was both a symbol of power and dominance over the wider hinterland with its everyday economic life, and the point from which to oversee not only ritual routes but also the trade paths passing nearby. Of course, each individual hillfort may have had its own primary function. In some cases it was indeed a settlement, a place of permanent residence for part of the community, while the rest lived below in the valley, in smaller villages, many of which probably still remain unidentified. Elsewhere it may have been above all a ritual center, permanently occupied only by a few cult specialists and crowded only during major gatherings or offerings to the gods. Smaller hillforts may have been watch points from which people simply observed what was happening along key routes. In any case, neighboring hillforts almost always had visual contact with one another. This was true in the Murtal. It was certainly true in Sulmtal and between Bubenberg and Plački Vrh. From Brinjeva Gora, from Rifnik and from home, people must also have been able to see their smaller neighbors. And most likely this direct visibility was used for communication by means of signal fires in the dark hours. Who knows, perhaps a fire lit and kept burning all evening on a hill visible from far away served as a kind of inland lighthouse for travelers who had been delayed on the road, riding all day from afar with a long-awaited load or important news. It's so important when making your way through the darkness to see ahead of you that small flickering patch of light that gives hope, and in that moment to feel that you are not alone, that up there beside that fire is surely warm, sheltered and at last safe, because that is where your home is. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and leave your comment. I would love to hear what you think of the story I've just shared with you. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do. It really helps and I promise it's worth it. And if you'd like to support my work and help me to create the next parts of the hills a bit faster, you can do that through Buy Me a Coffee. You will find the details in the first comment under this video. Thanks again, see you soon!